The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory, 1868, as Ethan Wilcox rode hard against the setting sun, the wound in his shoulder a constant reminder of the promise he'd made to a dying man. Blood seeped through his shirt, but he gritted his teeth and pressed onward. Somewhere ahead, beyond the vast expanse of prairie and rolling hills, lay the Comanche camp where 3 women from Laramie were being held captive, including Abigail Montgomery, the schoolteacher he'd admired from afar but never found the courage to court. "Hold on," he whispered as the wind carried his words away. "I'm coming for you." Ethan had been trailing cattle with the other ranch hands when news reached them of the raid. Laramie had been relatively peaceful these past months, with the railroad bringing prosperity and new settlers. No one expected the sudden attack that left 7 dead and 3 women missing. When Sheriff Tanner gathered a posse, Ethan had been the first to volunteer. Now he was the only one left riding, the others either dead or turned back after the ambush that had separated them 2 days ago. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. Ethan dismounted beside a small creek, allowing his exhausted horse to drink. The animal had been pushing hard, and Ethan knew he couldn't ask much more without risking its collapse. He unsaddled the bay gelding, examining the wound on his own shoulder by the fading light. The bullet had passed clean through, but the pain was fierce and infection would set in if he didn't tend to it soon. As darkness enveloped the land, Ethan built a small fire, keeping it low to avoid detection. He boiled water in his tin cup, using it to clean his wound before binding it with a strip of relatively clean cloth from his saddlebag. The night grew cold, and he pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his broad shoulders. He thought of Abigail as he stared into the flames. The way her honey-brown hair caught the sunlight when she walked from the schoolhouse, the kindness in her eyes when she spoke to the children. The quiet strength she carried that seemed at odds with her delicate appearance. In the 8 months she'd been in Laramie, he'd only spoken to her a handful of times, usually tipping his hat as they passed on the street, occasionally exchanging pleasantries about the weather. Once he'd helped her carry books to the schoolhouse, and the smile she gave him had haunted his dreams for weeks after. "I should have told you," he murmured to the night. "Should have found the words." The wind picked up, howling across the open plains like a mournful spirit. In its eerie cry, Ethan heard the echo of the oath he'd sworn over the graves of those killed in the raid, to bring the women home or die trying. It wasn't bravado that drove him now, but a quiet, desperate determination. He knew the odds. 1 man against an unknown number of Comanche warriors wasn't likely to succeed, but he couldn't turn back. Wouldn't turn back. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of screams and blood and Abigail's face contorted in terror. He woke before dawn, his body stiff and aching, the wound in his shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat. After a meager breakfast of jerky and the last of his coffee, he saddled his horse and continued east. By midday, the landscape began to change, the open prairie giving way to more rugged terrain with scattered stands of cottonwood and willow along the winding creeks. Ethan kept to the high ground where possible, scanning the horizon for any sign of smoke or movement. The Comanche were masters of the land, able to disappear into the landscape in ways that still mystified most white men. But Ethan had spent much of his life in these territories, learning from old mountain men and friendly Shoshone scouts about tracking and survival. It was late afternoon when he spotted the first sign, a series of tracks crossing a muddy stream bed. He dismounted, studying the impressions carefully. Several horses, moving at a steady pace, heading southeast. From the depth and pattern, he estimated they'd passed this way no more than a day ago. His heart quickened. If he rode through the night, he might catch them tomorrow, but caution tempered his excitement. Rushing blindly would only get him killed, and then Abigail and the others would have no hope at all. He needed to be smart to use what advantages he had. The Comanche wouldn't expect a lone man to follow them, especially not this far from Laramie. Surprise might be his only ally. As dusk approached, Ethan spotted a thin column of smoke rising from a sheltered valley about 2 miles distant. He secured his horse in a stand of trees and proceeded on foot, moving as silently as his years on the frontier had taught him. The wound in his shoulder protested with each step, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing on his breathing, on placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs or dislodging stones. From the ridge above the valley, he had a clear view of the camp below. There were 8 warriors that he could count, gathered around a fire. Their horses were picketed nearby, and several hide tipis had been erected in a loose circle. On the far side of the camp, he spotted 3 figures huddled together, women in torn, dirty dresses, their hands bound before them. Ethan's breath caught as he recognized Abigail's slender form. Even from this distance, he could see that her normally neat appearance had been ravaged by the ordeal. Her dress was tattered, her hair hanging loose around her face. But she sat upright, her back straight, and seemed to be speaking quietly to the other 2 women, Clara Wilson, the blacksmith's daughter, and Elizabeth Dawson, the young bride who'd arrived on the stagecoach just a month prior. Ethan settled in to watch, noting the patterns of the camp, which warriors seemed to be in charge, how often they changed guards, where weapons were kept. As night fell completely, the activity in the camp slowed. 2 warriors remained awake, keeping watch while the others retired to the tipis. The women were taken to one of the smaller shelters, a guard positioned outside. The odds were impossible, 8 against 1. Even if he waited until most were asleep, he couldn't hope to overcome them all. He needed a plan that didn't rely on strength alone. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of rain. Ethan glanced at the sky, noting the heavy clouds gathering to the west. A storm was coming, which might provide cover but would also make travel more difficult. He had to move tonight before the weather turned. He retreated from his position, working his way back to where he'd left his horse. From his saddlebags, he took inventory of his resources. His Winchester rifle with 27 rounds, his Colt revolver with 12 rounds, a hunting knife, some rope, and a few other supplies. Not much to wage war with, but it would have to do. An idea began to form, dangerous, desperate, but possibly their only chance. He wouldn't be able to fight all the warriors, but maybe he didn't have to. If he could create a distraction big enough, he might be able to reach the women and escape in the confusion. Ethan spent the next hour preparing, checking his weapons, fashioning crude but effective noisemakers from stones wrapped in pieces of his spare shirt. When all was ready, he left his horse saddled and ready at the edge of the trees closest to the camp, hidden but accessible. Then he made his way to the opposite side of the valley, placing his distractions at strategic points. The camp had grown quiet, with only the 2 sentries still visibly awake. Ethan positioned himself in the shadows near the horses, waiting for the right moment. The wind was growing stronger, the promised storm drawing closer. He felt the first drops of rain on his face as he struck a match and lit the small bundle of oil-soaked rags he'd prepared, quickly tossing it into the dry brush some distance from the camp. The fire caught quickly, and within moments, the brush was ablaze, sending sparks into the night sky. Ethan triggered his first noisemaker, creating a sound like stones falling down the ridge. The sentries reacted immediately, shouting and waking the others. As the warriors emerged from their tipis, Ethan set off the remaining distractions, creating the illusion of an attack from multiple directions. In the chaos, he moved swiftly toward the tipi where the women were held. The guard had left his post to join the others in defending against the perceived threat. Ethan sliced through the hide covering with his knife, finding the 3 women inside, huddled together, eyes wide with fear. "Miss Montgomery," he whispered. "It's Ethan Wilcox from Laramie. I've come to take you home." Abigail's face transformed, fear giving way to astonishment and then desperate hope. "Mr. Wilcox, how? No time," he cut her off, using his knife to saw through the ropes binding her wrists. "We need to move, now." As soon as the women were free, he led them in a crouched run toward where he'd left the horses. The diversion was already failing as the warriors realized there was no large attacking force. Shouts in Comanche told him they'd discovered the women missing. "Take the horse," he instructed, helping Abigail into the saddle, then lifting Clara up behind her. Head northwest. There's a stand of trees about 5 miles from here beside a creek. Wait for me there." "What about you?" Abigail asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I'll bring Mrs. Dawson on foot. We'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and from the look in Abigail's eyes, she knew it, but there was no other choice. His horse couldn't carry 4, and they had no time to argue. "Go," he urged, slapping the horse's flank. As the animal bolted away with its 2 riders, Ethan turned to Elizabeth, the youngest of the 3, barely 19 and trembling with terror. "Stay close to me," he said, drawing his revolver. "We're going to have to run." They made it perhaps 50 yards before the first shots rang out. Ethan pushed Elizabeth down behind a boulder, returning fire to keep the warriors at bay. 3 of them were in pursuit, the others presumably chasing after Abigail and Clara on horseback. "When I fire next," he told Elizabeth, "run for those rocks there." He pointed to a formation about 20 yards ahead that would provide their next cover. She nodded, her face pale in the darkness. Ethan fired twice more, then gave her a gentle push. "Now." Elizabeth ran, her skirts gathered in her hands, moving with surprising speed for someone who'd been captive for days. Ethan provided covering fire, then followed, diving behind the rocks as bullets struck around him. They continued this way for nearly a mile, moving from cover to cover, Ethan firing sparingly to conserve ammunition. His shoulder wound had reopened, blood flowing freely down his arm, but he couldn't stop to tend it. Elizabeth was holding up better than he'd expected, her initial terror giving way to a grim determination to survive. The storm hit in full force, rain pouring down in heavy sheets that limited visibility but also made it harder for their pursuers to track them. Ethan led them into a ravine, hoping the rushing water would hide their trail. "We need to find shelter," he shouted over the storm. "Can you go on a little further?" Elizabeth nodded, her soaked hair plastered to her face. They continued downstream, the water rising around their ankles as the rain intensified. Finally, Ethan spotted what he was looking for: a small cave in the ravine wall, partially hidden by overhanging brush. Inside, they collapsed, both gasping for breath. The cave wasn't deep, but it was dry and provided shelter from both the storm and their pursuers. Ethan checked his ammunition, 7 rounds left in the revolver, 18 in the rifle. Not enough if the Comanche found them, but it would have to do. "You think Miss Montgomery and Clara got away?" Elizabeth asked, her voice small in the darkness. "Yes," Ethan said with more confidence than he felt. "They had a good head start, and the storm will cover their tracks." "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming for us. We thought no one would." Ethan didn't respond. How could he explain that he would have crossed 100 plains, faced 1,000 warriors, for the chance to see Abigail Montgomery safe again? It wasn't heroism that drove him, but something far more selfish and desperate. They waited out the worst of the storm in silence. Ethan used the opportunity to rebind his shoulder, tearing strips from his already ruined shirt. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound was angry and hot to the touch, signs of infection setting in. As the first light of dawn filtered through the entrance of the cave, Ethan peered out cautiously. The rain had tapered to a gentle drizzle, and the ravine below was swollen with muddy water. There was no sign of their pursuers. "We need to move," he told Elizabeth. "Are you ready?" She nodded, rising to her feet with a wince. Ethan noticed for the first time the bruises on her arms, the cut on her cheek. What these women had endured during their captivity, he could only imagine, and his hatred for their captors burned even hotter. They followed the ravine for several miles, staying close to the water to mask their scent and tracks. Ethan's concern grew with each passing hour. By now, Abigail and Clara should have reached the stand of trees where he'd instructed them to wait, but he and Elizabeth were being forced to take a more circuitous route to avoid detection. Would Abigail wait, or would she continue on toward Laramie seeking help? By midday, they had reached more open country. Ethan's strength was fading, the combination of his wound, lack of food, and exertion taking its toll, but he pushed on, supporting Elizabeth when her own steps faltered. It was late afternoon when they spotted riders on the horizon. Ethan pulled Elizabeth down into the tall grass, watching intently as the figures approached. His heart sank as he recognized the distinctive silhouettes of Comanche warriors. "Stay here," he whispered to Elizabeth. "No matter what happens, don't move until they're gone. What are you going to do?" She asked, clutching his arm. "Draw them away from you." He pressed his revolver into her hand. "If I don't come back, wait until nightfall, then head northwest. Keep the North Star on your right shoulder and you'll reach the Platte River. Follow it west and you'll eventually find settlements." Before she could protest, he was gone, moving away from her hiding spot in a half-crouch. When he was about a quarter-mile distant, he stood upright, deliberately making himself visible to the riders. The warriors spotted him immediately, raising their weapons with triumphant cries. Ethan fired once into the air, then turned and ran, leading them away from Elizabeth's position. His legs felt leaden, his wounded shoulder a blazing agony, but he pushed himself harder than he ever had before. The warriors were closing in, their horses easily outpacing him across the open ground. Ethan zigzagged, making himself a more difficult target, but he knew it was only a matter of time. A bullet tore through the flesh of his thigh, sending him sprawling into the mud. He rolled onto his back, raising his Winchester for one final stand. If this was to be his end, he would make it count. 3 warriors circled him, their faces painted for war, expressions triumphant as they raised their weapons. The first shot caught them by surprise, not from Ethan's rifle, but from somewhere to the west. One of the warriors pitched sideways off his horse, and the others wheeled around in confusion. More shots followed, and Ethan realized with astonishment that a group of riders was charging toward them, rifles blazing. The remaining Comanche fled, unwilling to face this new threat. As the riders drew nearer, Ethan recognized the lead figure, Sheriff Tanner from Laramie, followed by half a dozen armed men. And riding double with one of them was Abigail Montgomery, her face alight with desperate hope as she spotted him lying in the grass. "Ethan," she cried, sliding from the horse before it had fully stopped and running to him. "Oh God, Ethan!" She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his wounds as if afraid to touch him. Sheriff Tanner and the others dismounted, approaching more cautiously. "Elizabeth," Ethan managed to say through gritted teeth. "Back there in the grass." 2 of the men immediately went to search, returning moments later with a sobbing Elizabeth Dawson. Sheriff Tanner knelt beside Ethan, his weathered face grave as he took in the extent of his injuries. "Didn't expect to find you alive, son," he said gruffly. "When Miss Montgomery and Miss Wilson reached us yesterday with news of your sacrifice, we figured we'd be bringing back a body." "Not dead yet," Ethan said, attempting a smile that came out as more of a grimace. Abigail's hands were gentle as she helped the men bind his wounds. "You saved us," she whispered. "You came for us when no one else would." "Couldn't leave you," he replied, his vision beginning to blur. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was Abigail's face, tear-streaked but beautiful, leaning over him with concern in her eyes. Ethan awoke to the sensation of movement, the steady rocking of a wagon beneath him. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on a pallet of blankets, a canvas cover overhead shielding him from the sun. His wounds had been properly dressed, and someone had given him water recently, as his throat wasn't as parched as he expected. "Welcome back," came a soft voice from beside him. He turned his head to find Abigail sitting on the wagon bench, looking down at him with relief in her eyes. Her hair was neatly braided again, though her dress was still torn and dirty. There was a scrape on her cheek and dark circles under her eyes, but to Ethan she had never looked more beautiful. "How long?" he asked, his voice rasping. 2 days, she replied. "You've been feverish. The doctor in the posse cleaned your wounds as best he could, but he says you'll need proper care when we reach Laramie." "Clara and Elizabeth? They're fine." Riding in the other wagon, Clara's ankle was sprained during our escape, but otherwise we're... She trailed off, her composure cracking slightly. "We're alive, thanks to you." Ethan tried to sit up, but the pain in his shoulder and leg forced him back down with a groan. "Don't try to move," Abigail scolded gently. "Dr. Ellis says you need to stay still or you'll start bleeding again." Ethan settled back, studying her face. "How did you find the sheriff? I told you to wait at the creek." A small, defiant smile curved her lips. "I decided your plan needed improvement. Clara and I rode through the night, following the North Star as my father taught me. We came across Sheriff Tanner and his men near the Platte. They'd been searching for us since the raid, but lost our trail after the ambush where you were separated. When I told them what you'd done, they insisted on going back for you immediately." "Foolish," Ethan murmured, though there was no censure in his voice. "No more foolish than one man going against an entire Comanche war party," she countered, her eyes flashing. "Why did you do it, Mr. Wilcox? Why did you come alone when the others turned back?" Ethan held her gaze, finding courage in the delirium of his fever that he might never have found otherwise. "I had to find you. The thought of you out there, afraid and in danger, I couldn't bear it." Something shifted in her expression, surprise, followed by a softening that made his heart beat faster despite his weakened state. "You risked your life for all of us," she said quietly. "For you," he corrected, too tired to dissemble. "The others too, of course, but—" "It was the thought of you that kept me going." A flush spread across her cheeks and she looked away, but not before he caught the small smile that curved her lips. "You should rest," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We still have 2 days' journey to Laramie." Ethan closed his eyes, allowing the rocking of the wagon to lull him. Despite his pain, a strange peace settled over him. Abigail was safe. Whatever happened now, he had kept his promise. The journey back to Laramie passed in a haze of pain and fever for Ethan. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to find Abigail bathing his forehead with cool water, other times to the gruff ministrations of Dr. Ellis checking his wounds. Through it all, he was aware of Abigail's presence, her voice reading to him from a book someone had brought along, her hands adjusting his blankets, her soft humming when she thought he was asleep. On the evening of the 4th day, they reached Laramie. Ethan was barely conscious as they carried him into Dr. Ellis's office on Main Street. The town had turned out to welcome the returning party, cheering the rescue of the women and the bravery of their saviors. Ethan was aware only dimly of faces peering in at him, of voices raised in question and concern. Then there was the sharp pain of the doctor properly cleaning and stitching his wounds, the bitter taste of laudanum and blessed oblivion. When he next woke properly, sunlight was streaming through lace curtains, and he was lying in a real bed in a room he didn't recognize. His wounds had been professionally dressed, and he was wearing a clean nightshirt that wasn't his own. For a moment he thought he might be dreaming still, until the door opened and Abigail entered, carrying a tray. She stopped when she saw he was awake, a smile spreading across her face. "Good morning," she said, approaching the bed and setting the tray on the nightstand. "How are you feeling?" Ethan took stock of himself. His shoulder and leg throbbed dully, but the fever seemed to have broken. "Better," he said cautiously. "Where am I?" "My home," she replied, pouring water from a pitcher into a glass. "Dr. Ellis said you needed proper nursing and the hotel was too noisy. Mrs. Patterson from the church is staying here as chaperone, so there's no need to worry about proprieties." She helped him sit up enough to drink, her hands steady and sure. Ethan noticed that she was wearing a simple blue dress, her honey brown hair neatly arranged in a bun at the nape of her neck. The bruises on her face were beginning to fade and some of the strain had left her eyes. "How long have I been here?" he asked after drinking deeply. 3 days. The doctor was concerned about infection, but your fever broke yesterday evening." She sat on the edge of the bed, her expression growing serious. "He says you'll recover fully, though the leg may trouble you in cold weather." Ethan nodded, processing this. "And you, Clara and Elizabeth, we're all well, physically at least." She looked down at her hands. "The nightmares will take longer to fade, I think, but we're home safe thanks to you." There was something in her voice, a warmth that hadn't been there in their few interactions before. Ethan watched her face, trying to read what was in her eyes. "I should never have let them take you," he said quietly. Abigail's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "Let them? You weren't even in town when the raid happened. How could you have prevented it?" "I should have been there. Should have." "No," she interrupted firmly. "Don't take that burden on yourself, Ethan Wilcox. What happened wasn't your fault. What matters is that you came for us when no one else would or could." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with fever. Before he could respond, however, the door opened again, and an older woman with iron-gray hair entered, looking disapprovingly at Abigail sitting on the edge of Ethan's bed. "Miss Montgomery, the Reverend is here to see Mr. Wilcox," she announced pointedly. Abigail rose, smoothing her skirts. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Please show him in." To Ethan, she added, "I'll return later with some broth if you feel up to eating." As she left, Reverend Howard entered, a Bible tucked under his arm and a broad smile on his face. "Mr. Wilcox, it does my heart good to see you awake. The entire town has been praying for your recovery." The next week passed slowly for Ethan. His strength returned gradually, and by the 5th day, he was able to sit up in a chair by the window, watching the activity on the street below. Abigail's small house was situated just off Main Street, close enough to the school where she taught for an easy walk. She returned each afternoon after classes, often bringing books or newspapers to read to him. Sometimes they played checkers, which Ethan was dismayed to discover she was far better at than he. Other times they simply talked, learning more about each other in those quiet hours than they had in the 8 months since she'd arrived in Laramie. He learned that she was 23, born and raised in St. Louis, the daughter of a riverboat captain who had instilled in her a love of adventure and independence rare in women of her station. She had come west after her parents' deaths, drawn by the opportunity to teach in a place where education was still a precious commodity. In turn, he told her about his own past, orphaned at 12, raised by an uncle who worked the cattle drives, finding his way to Wyoming Territory 5 years ago and settling in Laramie when the town began to grow around the new railroad. He spoke of his small ranch outside town, the herd he was building, his hopes for the future. What he didn't say, but what hung in the air between them during those conversations, was how deeply his feelings for her had grown. It wasn't just the infatuation he'd felt before, the admiration from afar. Now he knew her courage, her intelligence, her gentle humor that emerged more each day as the shadows of her ordeal receded. And each day he found himself falling more deeply in love with the woman she truly was. On the 10th day after their return to Laramie, Dr. Ellis declared Ethan fit enough to return to his own home, provided he continued to rest and didn't attempt to work for at least another week. The news brought mixed emotions, relief at his recovery, but reluctance to leave the haven of Abigail's home, where her presence had become as necessary to him as air. "I've arranged for Tom Jenkins to drive you out to your ranch tomorrow," Abigail told him as they sat on her small porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant colors. Mrs. Patterson dozed in a rocking chair nearby, her chaperone duties somewhat relaxed as Ethan's departure approached. "Thank you," Ethan said, studying her profile. "For everything. I don't know how I can repay your kindness." Abigail turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "There's nothing to repay after what you did for us, for me." She trailed off, and Ethan saw her twist her hands in her lap, a gesture he'd come to recognize as a sign of inner turmoil. He reached over, covering her hands with one of his own. "What is it?" he asked gently. She met his gaze directly, a courage in her eyes that took his breath away. "I find myself reluctant to see you go." The simple admission sent his heart racing. "Abigail, I know it's forward of me to say such things," she continued quickly, "and perhaps you don't feel the same way. But these days, sitting with you, talking with you, they've meant a great deal to me, more than I expected." Ethan tightened his grip on her hands. "They've meant everything to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every moment with you has been a gift I never thought to receive." Her eyes widened, hope blooming in their depths. "Truly, truly." He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Abigail, before all this happened, I admired you from afar. I watched you walk from the schoolhouse each day and thought you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. But I was too cowardly to approach you properly. It took almost losing you to make me realize what a fool I'd been." A smile curved her lips, tender and full of wonder. "And now, Now I know that your beauty is the least of your qualities, he said earnestly. Your courage, your kindness, your spirit, these are what I love about you now. The word love hung in the air between them, neither taking it back nor rushing past it. Abigail's eyes shone with unshed tears in the gathering dusk. When I was captive, she said softly, I thought of Laramie, of my students, of all I might never see again. But in those darkest moments, it was your face that came to me, Ethan, your smile when you tipped your hat to me on the street, the way you looked at me when you thought I wouldn't notice. She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. I always noticed you. Ethan's heart felt too full for his chest. With gentle reverence, he raised one hand to her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. I love you, Abigail Montgomery. I think perhaps I have since the first moment I saw you step down from the stagecoach last fall. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. And I love you, Ethan Wilcox, an emotion I never expected to find in this wild country, yet here it is. From the rocking chair came a pointed clearing of the throat. Mrs. Patterson's eyes were still closed, but her expression suggested she was no longer sleeping. Ethan reluctantly withdrew his hand, though his smile remained. Will you permit me to call on you properly once I'm settled back at my ranch? He asked. Abigail's answering smile was radiant. I would be disappointed if you didn't. The following morning dawned clear and bright, with the crispness of early autumn in the air. Ethan stood on Abigail's porch, leaning on a cane the doctor had insisted he use until his leg healed completely. Tom Jenkins waited in a wagon at the gate, ready to drive him the 5 miles to his small ranch outside town. You have everything? Abigail asked, handing him a package wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Patterson insisted on sending some of her corn bread, and there's a jar of preserves from my pantry as well. Thank you, Ethan said, taking the package and letting his fingers brush against hers. I'll be back in town for Sunday services. Her eyes brightened. I'll look forward to it. For a moment they stood awkwardly, constrained by the public setting and the conventions that governed their world. Then Abigail stepped closer, reaching up to straighten his collar in a gesture so domestic it made his heart ache with longing. Be careful with that leg, she said softly. Don't try to do too much too soon. Yes, madam, he replied with a small smile. She rolled her eyes at his teasing tone but smiled back. Go on then, Tom's waiting. Ethan held her gaze a moment longer, trying to convey all he couldn't say aloud. I'll see you Sunday. The days until Sunday stretched interminably. Ethan's ranch hand, Miguel, had kept things running in his absence and was visibly relieved to have him back, though he clucked disapprovingly at Ethan's condition and insisted on handling the more strenuous chores himself. Ethan chafed at the enforced idleness, but used the time to make plans, thinking through what would be needed if, when Abigail agreed to share his life, the small 2-room cabin would need expansion. The herd was doing well, but he'd need to increase it further to provide properly for a family. And there were 100 other considerations, practical matters that occupied his mind during the daylight hours. At night, though, his thoughts were of Abigail herself, her smile, her voice, the feel of her hand in his. Sometimes the memories of their ordeal intruded, nightmares of what might have happened if he hadn't found her in time. On those nights, he would sit on his porch until dawn, the wind carrying his renewed promises into the vast Wyoming night. Sunday finally arrived, and Ethan dressed with unusual care in his best shirt and the suit he wore only for church and funerals. His leg was healing well, but he brought the cane anyway, knowing Abigail would scold him if he didn't. The ride into town seemed to take half the time it usually did, his anticipation making the miles fly by. The church was already filling when he arrived. Ethan nodded to familiar faces as he made his way inside, accepting handshakes and backslaps from men who had heard the story of the rescue. He was scanning the pews for Abigail when Clara Wilson approached, her normally shy demeanor set aside as she clasped his hand warmly. Mr. Wilcox, she said, I never properly thanked you for what you did. My father says there aren't words enough, and he's right, but thank you. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. No thanks needed, Miss Wilson. I'm just glad you're safe. He hesitated, then asked, Have you seen Miss Montgomery this morning? A knowing smile touched Clara's lips. She's helping with the children's Sunday school. They should be finishing soon. As if summoned by their conversation, the side door opened, and Abigail appeared, ushering a group of children before her. She wore a dove-gray dress with subtle blue piping that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair arranged in an elegant twist beneath a modest hat. When she spotted Ethan, her entire face lit up with a smile so radiant it took his breath away. She said something to the children, who scattered to find their parents, then made her way toward him. You came, she said, as if she had harbored some doubt. Wild horses couldn't have kept me away, he replied, drinking in the sight of her. They sat together during the service, close but not touching, mindful of the eyes upon them. Reverend Howard's sermon was about God's providence in times of trial, with pointed references to the recent rescue that had the congregation nodding in agreement. Ethan was aware of Abigail beside him, of her scent lavender and clean soap, of the way her hand rested just inches from his on the pew between them. After the service, they stood in the churchyard, accepting congratulations and well wishes from the townsfolk. Elizabeth Dawson approached with her husband, her eyes clearer now, the haunted look beginning to fade. Mr. Wilcox, she said warmly, it's good to see you on your feet again. Thank you, Mrs. Dawson, you're looking well. Getting there, she admitted with a small smile. The nightmares are less frequent now. My Henry has been a rock. She glanced fondly at her husband, who stood protectively at her side. As they chatted, Ethan noticed the way the town had subtly rearranged itself around Abigail and himself, as if they were already a couple. No one seemed surprised to see them together. Indeed, there was an air of satisfaction in the glances cast their way, as if the town had collectively decided this pairing was right and proper. When the churchyard finally began to empty, Ethan turned to Abigail. Would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner at the hotel restaurant? Her smile was answer enough, but she nodded for good measure. I would like that very much. The Grand Laramie Hotel was the finest establishment in town, its restaurant featuring tablecloths and proper china imported from back east. As Ethan escorted Abigail inside, he was acutely conscious of how right it felt to have her on his arm, of how naturally they moved together. They were shown to a table near the window, where the afternoon sunlight cast a golden glow over the crisp white tablecloth. Ethan held Abigail's chair for her, then seated himself across from her. This is quite an occasion, she observed, looking around at the elegant surroundings. I've only eaten here once before, when I first arrived in Laramie. I thought we deserved something special, Ethan replied. Besides, Mrs. Patterson isn't here to chaperone, so a public venue seemed appropriate. Abigail's lips twitched with amusement. Ever mindful of proprieties, Mr. Wilcox? When it concerns your reputation, always, he said seriously. You're too important to me to risk gossip that might hurt you, her expression softened. Thank you, though I think the town has already decided we're a foregone conclusion. They ordered roast beef for Ethan, chicken for Abigail, and as they waited for their food, the conversation flowed easily between them. Ethan told her about his plans for the ranch, and she shared stories of her students' antics that made him laugh aloud. It was during dessert apple pie with fresh cream that Ethan finally broached the subject that had been on his mind all week. Abigail, he began, setting down his fork, I know this might seem rushed to some, especially given all that's happened recently. But the truth is, I've been thinking about this for much longer than you know. She stilled, her eyes widening slightly as she understood the direction of his words. When I was tracking the Comanche, he continued, crossing those plains with nothing but the wind and my promise to keep me company, I made another vow. I promised myself that if I found you alive, I would never again waste time being too afraid to tell you how I feel. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. I love you. These past months watching you from afar and these past weeks coming to know you better have only deepened that love. Abigail's fingers tightened around his, her eyes bright with emotion. I don't have much to offer, Ethan admitted. My ranch is small, the cabin modest, but I promise you this every day of my life would be devoted to your happiness, to building a life worthy of you." He took a deep breath, gathering his courage for the final step. "Abigail Montgomery, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Time seemed to stand still as he waited for her answer. Abigail's free hand rose to her lips, and for one terrible moment, Ethan feared he had misjudged, moved too quickly. Then she smiled a smile of such pure joy it transformed her face into something almost luminous. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Wilcox." Relief and happiness flooded through him in equal measure. "You're certain?" "I know it hasn't been long. Some things don't require a long time to know," she interrupted gently. "Some things you know in your heart from the very beginning, even if your head takes longer to catch up." Ethan wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms then and there, but the public setting and his own sense of propriety held him back. Instead, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a fervent kiss to her knuckles. "You have made me the happiest man in the Wyoming Territory," he said, his voice husky with emotion. How soon would you consider?" Abigail laughed, the sound like music to his ears. "Are you asking when I'll marry you, Mr. Wilcox?" "I am, Miss Montgomery." "If it were up to me, I'd ride for the preacher today, but I suspect you might have other ideas." She considered, her head tilted thoughtfully. "The school term ends in 6 weeks. That would give us time to prepare properly and for you to finish healing." 6 weeks seemed an eternity, but Ethan nodded, willing to wait as long as necessary if it meant Abigail would be his wife. 6 weeks it is, then. News of their engagement spread through Laramie faster than a prairie fire. By the time Ethan escorted Abigail back to her home that afternoon, neighbors were already stopping by with congratulations. Mrs. Patterson received them in the parlor, her stern countenance softened by evident approval of the match. "I always said Miss Montgomery needed a steady man," she declared, pouring tea for the three of them. "And after what you did, Mr. Wilcox, no one could doubt your character." The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations and planning. Ethan threw himself into improving his ranch, hiring additional hands to help expand the cabin into a proper home. 2 new rooms were added, a larger bedroom and a dedicated kitchen, and the original space was transformed into a comfortable parlor and dining area. He ordered furniture from Denver, including a rocking chair for the porch where he imagined Abigail sitting on summer evenings. Abigail, meanwhile, continued teaching while also preparing for her new life. The women of Laramie rallied around her, organizing sewing circles to create linens and curtains, offering advice on managing a ranch household, and planning a proper wedding with all the trimmings their frontier town could provide. They saw each other every day, Ethan riding into town in the evenings to spend time with his fiancée, sometimes taking her for drives in the countryside, other times simply sitting with her on the porch swing, talking about their future together. As the wedding day approached, however, shadows from their ordeal occasionally resurfaced. One evening, as they walked along the edge of town, Abigail grew quiet, her expression troubled. "What is it?" Ethan asked, concerned by her sudden change in mood. She hesitated, then said, "Sometimes I still see them in my dreams. The warriors, the camp. I wake up thinking I'm still there, that the rescue never happened." Ethan stopped, turning to face her. "Abigail, I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that these nightmares will follow me into our marriage, that there will be nights when I wake screaming when I can't bear to be touched." Her vulnerability broke his heart. With infinite gentleness, he took her hands in his. "Then I will be there to remind you that you're safe. To hold you if you want to be held, or to give you space if that's what you need." He searched her eyes, willing her to believe him. "There is nothing that could happen that would make me love you less or regret making you my wife." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, a small, brave smile forming. "How did I find someone like you in this wild country?" "I believe we found each other," he replied, "and whatever darkness still lingers from what happened, we'll face it together." She stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest. Ethan's arms came around her, holding her with a tenderness that belied the strength in his rancher's hands. "Together," she echoed, the word muffled against his shirt but clear in its conviction. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed created especially for beginnings. The entire town of Laramie turned out for the event, filling the small church to overflowing. Ethan stood at the altar beside Reverend Howard, his best man Miguel from the ranch at his side, trying not to fidget as he waited for his bride. When the church doors opened and Abigail appeared on the arm of Sheriff Tanner, who had offered to give her away, Ethan forgot how to breathe. She wore a gown of ivory silk, a luxury ordered specially from Denver with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves. Her honey-brown hair was arranged in soft curls beneath a veil, and she carried a bouquet of late wildflowers gathered from the prairie around Laramie. But it was her smile, radiant and sure, that captivated him most as she walked down the aisle toward him. In that smile was everything he had ever wanted: love, trust, promise, hope, all directed at him with an intensity that humbled him to his core. The ceremony itself passed in a blur for Ethan. He was aware of speaking his vows, of slipping the simple gold band onto Abigail's finger, of the moment when Reverend Howard pronounced them husband and wife. But what he remembered most clearly was the look in Abigail's eyes as she gazed up at him, and the feel of her lips against his when they sealed their union with a kiss that sent the congregation into appreciative applause. The celebration afterward was held in the town square, with tables laden with food contributed by every household in Laramie. There was music from a hastily assembled band, dancing on a wooden platform erected for the occasion, and enough goodwill to make the autumn air feel as warm as summer. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the festivities, Ethan found a moment alone with his new wife. They stood at the edge of the square, his arm around her waist, watching their friends and neighbors continue the celebration. "Mrs. Wilcox," he said, testing the name on his tongue and finding it perfect. Abigail looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "I'm still getting used to that," she admitted with a smile, "but I think I like it very much. Are you ready to go home?" he asked softly. Her smile deepened, a promise in its curve that sent his heart racing. "Yes," she replied. "Take me home, Ethan." Their departure was marked with cheers and well wishes, a shower of rice and flower petals following them to the waiting wagon that would take them to their ranch. As they drove away from Laramie, the sound of celebration fading behind them, Abigail leaned against Ethan's side, her head on his shoulder. "It's hard to believe," she said, watching the landscape pass by in the gathering dusk. 6 weeks ago, I thought I might never see Laramie again. Now I'm leaving it as your wife." Ethan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Life takes strange turns," he agreed, "but I can't regret the path that led us here, no matter how difficult parts of the journey were." She was quiet for a moment, then said thoughtfully, "That night when you were tracking us, when the wind was howling across the plains, did you ever lose hope?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "There were moments when I doubted my ability to find you, to reach you in time. But lose hope entirely? No, I had made a promise to myself, to you, to the wind itself. As long as I had breath in my body, I was going to keep searching." Abigail's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. "I think somehow I knew that. Even in the darkest moments of captivity, I had this sense that someone was coming, that I wasn't forgotten." "You never could be," Ethan said fervently, "not by me." As they approached the ranch, the house came into view, lamplight glowing warmly in the windows, smoke rising from the chimney where Miguel had lit a fire before discreetly making himself scarce for the night. It looked like exactly what it was, a home waiting for them to begin their life together. Ethan helped Abigail down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. She laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he navigated the doorway. "Your leg," she protested. "Is perfectly healed," he assured her, setting her down gently in the middle of their parlor. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wilcox." Abigail looked around, taking in the changes he had made to the cabin, the fresh paint, the new curtains sewn by the ladies of Laramie, the comfortable furniture arranged to create a cozy living space. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "Truly lovely." Ethan watched her move through the rooms, trailing her fingers along the surfaces, examining the details with evident pleasure. When she reached the bedroom and saw the large four-poster bed with its quilt of blue and cream, she paused, a becoming blush coloring her cheeks. He approached slowly, giving her time to adjust to this new reality. "I wanted everything to be perfect for you," he said quietly. She turned to face him, her eyes shining with emotion. "It is perfect because you're here." With gentle reverence, Ethan reached for her, his hands framing her face as he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that was both tender and filled with promise. Abigail responded eagerly, her arms encircling his waist, her body melting against his with a trust that humbled him. As the night deepened around them, they discovered each other with the wonder of new lovers and the deeper connection of souls who had already faced darkness together and emerged stronger. Ethan's touch was gentle, mindful of the trauma she had endured, but Abigail's response was uninhibited, her love for him washing away the shadows of the past. In the quiet afterward, as they lay tangled together beneath the quilt, Abigail rested her head on Ethan's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she murmured, "especially not after." Ethan's arms tightened around her. "The past doesn't define us," he said firmly. "It's just part of the path that brought us here." She raised her head to look at him, her eyes serious in the dim light of the single lamp they'd left burning. "Thank you for crossing those plains for me, for not giving up when anyone else would have." "I would cross 1,000 plains for you," he said simply, "and I plan to spend the rest of my life proving that to you every day." Her smile was like the dawn breaking after the longest night. "I'm going to hold you to that promise, Ethan Wilcox." "I'm counting on it, Abigail Wilcox," he replied, sealing his words with a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. 2 years passed, seasons turning with the rhythm of ranch life, each day bringing Ethan and Abigail closer together as they built their life on the Wyoming frontier. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, Ethan's knowledge of cattle and land management, complemented by Abigail's organizational skills and practical wisdom. They added a small herd of sheep, which proved more profitable than expected, and expanded their garden to include not just vegetables but flowers that Abigail insisted brought beauty necessary for the soul. Laramie itself was growing rapidly, the railroad bringing new settlers and businesses. Abigail continued teaching, riding into town 3 days a week on the gentle mare Ethan had given her as a wedding present. Her students adored her and she them, though she admitted to Ethan that she was beginning to long for children of her own. That wish was granted in the spring of their 2nd year of marriage, when Abigail discovered she was with child. The news transformed their already happy home into a place of joyous anticipation. Ethan found himself planning for the future with renewed purpose, thinking of what his child's son or daughter would need to thrive in this wild, beautiful country. "What shall we name the baby if it's a boy?" Abigail asked one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains with gold and purple shadows. Ethan considered, his hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "What about James after your father?" Her smile was tender. "I'd like that." "And if it's a girl?" "Something strong but beautiful," he mused, "like her mother." Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder. "We have time to decide. The baby won't come until winter." As her pregnancy progressed, Ethan found himself more protective than ever, insisting on accompanying her to town for her teaching days, watching her like a hawk for any sign of discomfort or fatigue. Abigail tolerated his hovering with good-natured patience, though she drew the line when he suggested she give up teaching entirely. "I'm having a baby, not becoming an invalid," she informed him with a firmness that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her. "I'll teach until the end of the fall term, and that's that." Ethan knew better than to argue when she used that tone. Besides, she was radiant in her pregnancy, her natural beauty enhanced by the inner glow of impending motherhood. He couldn't deny her anything that brought her such evident joy. Their child, a son, James Ethan Wilcox, was born on a snowy December night, with Doc Ellis attending and Mrs. Patterson providing experienced assistance. Ethan paced the parlor throughout Abigail's labor, each cry from the bedroom sending a spike of fear through his heart. When at last he was allowed in to see his wife and newborn son, the sight of them together, Abigail tired but triumphant, the baby nestled against her breast, brought him to his knees beside the bed. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered, gently touching the downy head with its shock of dark hair. "Just like his mother." Abigail smiled, the exhaustion in her eyes tempered by a joy so profound it took his breath away. "Would you like to hold your son, Mr. Wilcox?" With hands that trembled slightly, Ethan took the tiny bundle, cradling his son against his chest with a reverence that made the women in the room exchange knowing smiles. The baby's eyes, still unfocused, seemed to seek his face, and Ethan felt a love so fierce and protective it nearly overwhelmed him. "Hello, James," he said softly. "Welcome to the world, son. Your mama and I have been waiting for you." As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, young James thrived under his parents' devoted care. He was a happy, healthy baby, quick to smile, and with a lusty cry that Ethan swore could be heard clear to Laramie when he was displeased. Abigail took to motherhood as naturally as she had to teaching, her patient, nurturing nature perfectly suited to raising a child in the sometimes harsh conditions of frontier life. Ethan found fatherhood both more challenging and more rewarding than he had anticipated. The responsibility was daunting, but the simple joy of watching his son grow, seeing him smile for the first time, hearing his first laugh, witnessing his first attempts to roll over, filled a place in his heart he hadn't known was empty. On the anniversary of their wedding, with James sleeping peacefully in the cradle Ethan had crafted from pine, they sat together on their porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Abigail's head rested on Ethan's shoulder, his arm around her waist, drawing her close against his side. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, the question that had become a ritual between them on significant days. Abigail tilted her face up to his, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Completely," she answered, the truth of it evident in her smile. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," Ethan replied, brushing a tender kiss against her forehead. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, you, James, this home we've built together." "It's real," she assured him, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. "All of it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The creak of the swing and the night sounds of the ranch, the low of cattle, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods, the distant howl of a coyote creating a symphony of contentment around them. "I've been thinking," Abigail said eventually, a note in her voice that caught Ethan's attention. "About what?" he prompted when she didn't continue. "About expanding the school in Laramie." She shifted to face him more directly. "The town is growing so quickly, and there are so many children now. We need a proper schoolhouse, not just the one room at the back of the church, and we need more teachers." Ethan nodded, knowing where this was leading. "You want to go back to teaching full-time?" "Not immediately," she clarified. "Not while James is still so young, but eventually, yes. And in the meantime, I thought I might help with the planning, perhaps teach part-time once the new school is built." He studied her face, seeing the passion for education that had drawn her west in the first place, the desire to contribute to their growing community. "I think it's a wonderful idea," he said sincerely. "Laramie would be lucky to have you back in the classroom whenever you're ready." Relief and gratitude softened her expression. "Thank you for understanding." "I married a teacher," Ethan reminded her with a smile. "I always knew your heart belonged partly to your students, and I wouldn't change that about you. It's part of who you are, part of what I love." Abigail leaned in, pressing a kiss to his lips that held both tenderness and promise. "I have the best of both worlds," she murmured. "A fulfilling vocation and a man who supports my dreams." As they continued discussing her plans for the school, their conversation was interrupted by a cry from inside the house. James was awake and making his needs known with impressive volume. "I'll go," Ethan said, rising from the swing. "You stay and enjoy the stars a bit longer." Inside, he lifted his son from the cradle, the familiar weight of the baby against his chest still a wonder after all these months. James quieted almost immediately, his little face turning up to Ethan's with what looked remarkably like recognition. "There now," Ethan soothed, moving back toward the porch. "Did you think we'd forgotten you? Not possible, son. Not possible at all." He rejoined Abigail, James cradled in the crook of his arm. She reached out, stroking the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. "He has your eyes," she observed, not for the first time, "and I think he's going to have your stubborn chin as well." "Heaven help us if he has my stubbornness and your determination," Ethan chuckled. "He'll be unstoppable." "That's the idea," Abigail replied with a smile. "We're raising him to be strong, to make his own way in the world someday." The thought of James grown, making his own choices, perhaps even having a family of his own, stretched before them like the vast Wyoming horizon, distant, but inevitable. Ethan found himself hoping that his son would someday find a love as deep and transformative as what he had found with Abigail. "Do you ever think about that night?" Abigail asked suddenly, her gaze turning toward the eastern plains, barely visible in the darkness. "When you were tracking us across the territory?" Ethan didn't need to ask which night she meant. Though they rarely spoke of her captivity now, it remained a defining moment in their shared history, the crucible in which their future together had been forged. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Mostly I remember the fear of not finding you in time, and then the moment when I first saw you in that camp, still alive, still fighting in your own way. I've never felt relief like that before or since." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I still have nightmares occasionally," she confessed. "Not as often now, but they still come. But you know what's different? In the dreams now, I know you're coming for me. Even in sleep, I hold on to that certainty." Ethan shifted James to his other arm so he could draw Abigail closer against his side. "I will always come for you," he promised. "No matter what, that's one oath I'll never break." She leaned into him, her hand resting lightly on their son's back. "I know." As the stars wheeled overhead and their child dozed between them, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From lonely days watching Abigail from afar, to the desperate pursuit across the plains, to these quiet evenings filled with the simple, profound joy of family, it was more than he had ever dared to hope for. The wind that had once carried his oath into the night now whispered through their home, bearing witness to the life they had built together. 5 years later, the Wilcox Ranch had expanded significantly, now encompassing over 1,000 acres with a herd of cattle that was the envy of the territory. The cabin had grown as well, with additions that included a proper dining room and 2 more bedrooms, one for James, now a lively and curious 6-year-old, and one for his sister, Emma Rose, who had joined the family 2 years earlier. Laramie itself had continued to prosper, the railroad bringing steady growth and increased commerce. The new schoolhouse Abigail had envisioned was now a reality, a handsome 2-story building on Main Street with separate classrooms for different age groups, and a small library that was her particular pride. She taught there 3 days a week, while a younger teacher handled the other days, an arrangement that allowed Abigail to balance her passion for education with her dedication to her family. Ethan had become a respected figure in the community, serving on the town council and helping to establish Laramie's first bank, where ranchers and merchants could conduct business without having to travel to Cheyenne. His reputation as a fair and honest man extended beyond business matters. Many remembered his heroic rescue of Abigail and the other women, a story that had grown somewhat in the telling but remained a testament to his character. Life wasn't without its challenges. The Wyoming weather remained unpredictable and sometimes harsh, with blizzards in winter that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time, and summer droughts that threatened the herds. There had been illnesses: James with a frightening fever that lasted 5 days when he was 4, Emma with croup that had Abigail walking the floor with her for nights on end. And the normal tensions of any marriage, disagreements about the children's upbringing or the running of the ranch that sometimes led to heated words but always, eventually, to reconciliation and deeper understanding. Through it all, the bond between Ethan and Abigail only strengthened, their love deepening with each challenge faced and overcome together. They had built something rare and precious, not just a successful ranch or a comfortable home, but a true partnership based on mutual respect and unwavering devotion. On a crisp October day, as golden aspen leaves drifted on the breeze, they celebrated their 7th wedding anniversary with a picnic beside the creek that ran through their property. James and Emma raced along the banks, searching for interesting stones and occasionally shrieking with delight when they found something particularly fascinating. Abigail leaned back against a fallen log, watching their children with a smile that never failed to warm Ethan's heart. At 32, she was more beautiful than ever, her face holding the serene confidence of a woman who knew herself and her place in the world. The honey-brown hair that had first caught Ethan's attention now held a few strands of silver, which she claimed were entirely his fault. "Penny for your thoughts," Ethan said, stretching out beside her on the blanket they'd spread across the grass. "I was just thinking how fortunate we are," she replied, turning that radiant smile on him, "to have all this." She gestured to encompass the children, the land, the life they'd built together. Ethan reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that had become habit over the years but still held meaning. "We've worked hard for it," he reminded her, "both of us." "Yes," she agreed. "But there's luck in it too, don't you think? Or perhaps providence, as Reverend Howard would say. So many things had to align for us to be here now, including some very dark moments." He knew she was thinking again of those days of captivity, of his desperate race across the plains to find her. Time had dulled the sharper edges of those memories for both of them, but they remained a touchstone, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything before it truly began. "I prefer to think we made our own luck," Ethan said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "You with your courage, me with my stubbornness." Abigail laughed, the sound still capable of making his heart skip a beat after all these years. "Your stubbornness has certainly served us well," she conceded, "though I maintain it's a trait our son has inherited in alarming measure." As if to prove her point, James chose that moment to engage in a heated debate with his younger sister about whether a particular rock was a genuine arrowhead or just an oddly shaped stone. His logical arguments and refusal to be swayed by Emma's tears were quintessential Ethan. "He'll make a fine lawyer someday," Ethan observed, watching his son with a mixture of pride and amusement. "Or a teacher," Abigail countered. "He has a way of explaining things that the other children respond to. Miss Fleming says he often helps the younger students with their letters." Ethan smiled, imagining James following in his mother's footsteps. "And Emma, what do you think she'll become?" They both turned to watch their daughter, who had already moved past the arrowhead dispute and was now attempting to construct a dam in the shallow edge of the creek, her little face set in an expression of intense concentration. "Something requiring determination and creativity," Abigail mused. "Perhaps an artist or a writer, or maybe she'll surprise us completely and become a cattle rancher like her father." The thought of petite, feminine Emma taking over the ranch operations made Ethan chuckle, though he didn't discount the possibility. Their daughter had inherited Abigail's quiet strength along with her delicate features. "Whatever they choose, they'll have our support," he said with certainty. "Just as you've supported me in building the ranch and I've supported your work with the school." Abigail squeezed his hand, acknowledging the truth of his words. Their partnership had been built on mutual respect for each other's dreams and ambitions, a rare equality that many marriages of their time lacked. The children eventually tired of their explorations and returned to the blanket, hungry for the picnic lunch Abigail had packed. As they ate fried chicken and apple pie, talking and laughing together in the dappled sunlight beneath the cottonwoods, Ethan felt a contentment so deep it bordered on awe. This was his family, his home, his life richer and more fulfilling than anything he could have imagined when he first spotted Abigail Montgomery stepping down from the stagecoach all those years ago. Later, as they packed up their picnic and headed back toward the house, James running ahead with Emma struggling to keep up on her shorter legs, Abigail slipped her arm through Ethan's, leaning into his side as they walked. "I have something to tell you," she said, a note in her voice that caught his full attention. He looked down at her, noting the slight flush on her cheeks and the way she bit her lip, a habit she'd had since he first knew her, usually when she was nervous or excited about something. "What is it?" he asked, slowing their pace to give her time. She glanced ahead to make sure the children were out of earshot, then said simply, "I believe we'll need to add another bedroom to the house by spring." For a moment, Ethan didn't understand, and then realization dawned. "Abigail, are you saying yes?" she confirmed, her smile blossoming. "Dr. Ellis confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. We're going to have another baby." Joy surged through Ethan, bright and fierce. In one swift movement, he swept Abigail into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed in surprise and delight. "Papa, what are you doing?" James called, having turned back to see what was delaying them. "Your mother has just made me very happy," Ethan called back, setting Abigail gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. "Why, what did she do?" Emma wanted to know, her little face scrunched in confusion. Abigail and Ethan exchanged a look, silently agreeing it was time to share the news. "Come here, both of you," Abigail beckoned. "We have something important to tell you." As the children gathered around, Ethan knelt to bring himself to their level. "Your mother and I are going to have another baby," he explained. "You're going to have a new brother or sister in the spring." James's eyes widened with interest. "A brother," he stated decisively. "I already have a sister." Emma looked thoughtful. "But I don't have a sister," she pointed out. "Can it be a girl, Mama?" Abigail laughed, ruffling her daughter's curls. "We don't get to choose, sweetheart. We'll have to wait and see what God sends us. But whether it's a boy or a girl, you'll both be wonderful older siblings, I'm sure." The children peppered them with questions as they continued toward the house. How big was the baby now? When exactly would it arrive? Where would it sleep? Would Emma have to share her toys? Ethan and Abigail answered patiently, Ethan's arm remaining around his wife's waist, his hand occasionally straying to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. That night, after the children were asleep and they had retired to their bedroom, Ethan held Abigail close, her head nestled against his chest as it had been since their first night together. "Another child," he marveled softly, his hand splayed across her abdomen. "I never imagined such happiness could be mine." Abigail tilted her face up to his, her eyes soft in the lamplight. "Nor I," she admitted, "especially not after." She didn't need to finish the thought. "It's been 9 years," Ethan reminded her gently, 9 years since those dark days. "And look at all the light that's come after." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that lately, especially since discovering I'm pregnant again, about how close we came to never having any of this." Her hand covered his where it rested on her stomach. "If you hadn't found us when you did." "But I did," Ethan said firmly. "That's what matters, not what might have happened, but what did happen. I found you, I brought you home, and we built this life together." "Yes," Abigail agreed, her smile returning. "We did, and it's a wonderful life, Ethan. More than I ever dreamed possible." He leaned down to kiss her, pouring all the love and gratitude he felt into the gesture. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Abigail Wilcox, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied softly. "My heroic cowboy who crossed the plains to find me." As they settled into sleep, Ethan's last thoughts were of the journey they had traveled together from fear and darkness to this place of profound joy and peace. The wind that once carried his desperate oath across the Wyoming plains now whispered gently around their home, a reminder of promises kept and a future still unfolding before them, bright with possibility and love.